one of the craziest things to me that I've realized in the world of female competitive, the female competitive side of things is like a lot of people are trying to prep females like they're small men. And it's like with no regard to the female physiology and the menstrual cycle. And it's like, look, women have a very short period of time where they have a reproductive like hormone cycle. And at some point it shuts down. And when it shuts down, that is attached to a lot of bad things that happen to women as they get older. You shouldn't start that process early. Like you shouldn't start that process when you start competing at 20. It's not normal for you to not have a period like when you're in your mid 20s, early 30s. Like that should still be functioning well. So the disregard to like that whole thing and seeing what some of these coaches are doing made me go, I need to know what I'm doing. I'm never going to have the experience of what it's actually like to have a menstrual cycle, but I can be so well versed in it that I can at least understand what might be going on so that we can get the response that we need.
I love that that was your thought process, even with like the higher divisions, where obviously like there's going to be a level of sacrifice and acceptance around, you know, what risks are assumed just competing in higher level divisions. And for listeners, when I say higher level, I mean higher degree of muscularity and higher conditioning requirements. So higher meaning they need to get leaner. Now, when we talk about like really the dysregulation of an ovulatory cycle, I've spoken about this at several points in different facets around how like this is something that is exacerbated by the use of PEDs. But I think a lot of people jump the gun and think, okay, PEDs are ultimately what's causing that dysregulation, where mistakenly what we're seeing is that the state of contest prep, being in that state of low energy availability for an extended duration, being under recovered, being undernourished, that ultimately is what's signaling to the hypothalamus, to the brain that, hey, we're not in a position where we can allocate these resources to non-critical functions. And I almost equate it, I've used this analogy before, is like, you know, you think back to high school, like some people's parents were like really strict. It's like you get a B minus, okay, grounded, no parties for the next month, not going to homecoming. Okay. Alternatively, you have the parent who's like, oh, well, you failed out of this class, you got caught drinking underage. Well, okay, just like don't do it again. It's kind of a slap on the wrist, you know? That is the equivalent of someone's like resilience. Oh, no, you're good. You're good. That's the equivalent to someone's resilience. And ultimately, there's no way to really know going into working with someone is like, how resilient are they going to be? It's because, like, yeah, for some people, they're going to have the strict parents. And in this analogy, if I completely lost listeners, the parent is your body's internal, you know, judge, basically saying, like, hey, you're getting close to being undernourished. I'm taking the keys away. You're grounded. You're staying home the rest of the term, whatever. And that's where I think we have to pay respect to that individual's resiliency and whether or not they are built for the sport. But that's a huge genetic component. Those are the cards you're dealt. And it's like we can do things to help, you know, optimize to help allow for more runway within someone's season. But ultimately, if someone has those super strict parents that are going to take away the keys, we have to respect that, not just in terms of PED use, but even in terms of timeline design and the extent at which we push them to those low body fat levels.
Yep. I mean, you already said it. It's like you can get a dysregulated menstrual cycle from just not eating enough. You can get a dysregulated menstrual cycle from being too lean, right? Like there's a lot of things that can cause dysregulation to that. And then you add drugs on top of it. And of course, you're going to be in a situation where like you're going to have a dysregulation. But the thing is like I have a natural wellness competitor who's 2.5 weeks out right now, hasn't touched anything at all, and literally just had her period. And we're 2.5 weeks out, like, and she's crazy lean, she's ready to go, and she's still having a healthy menstrual cycle. And like, sure, it wasn't always that way. It wasn't always like we've had some dysregulation and we've had some like kind of funniness going on, but the fact that it is still occurring is a win for us because that natural ebb and flow of those hormones is actually what's going to get us a better look. Like when your body's not fighting its physiology, you look better. And that goes for men too. Obviously, we don't have this hormone cycle that goes up and down like that. But when you have a better control over your hormone fluctuations, whether you're male or female, you're going to come out better on top. And like, I think too many girls are coming into the sport early before they really learn what their menstrual cycle is. It's just this like magic word that gets thrown out of like my menstrual cycle, and they don't understand what it means. It's like, oh, I know that means I'm gonna not feel great for this number of days out of the month, and it's gonna make me emotional at certain times. But beyond that, they don't know what those hormones and stuff do in the body that cause those ebbs and flows, right? So it's just like they never learn it, and then again, like I said, I'm never going to have a menstrual cycle. So I'm sure that week is hell. I'm sure it's not fun. And to have to do that every single month, it doesn't sound like fun. So I'm sure when you're young and don't really know any better, it's probably like, oh, I don't have a period. Great. I don't have to deal with that anymore. And it's like, well, that's not the right thing to do. We just need to make sure that we manage that menstrual cycle so that you don't have these aggressive side effects. And like, there's certainly circumstances where like we're not going to be able to manage that no matter what we do. It's just how your body responds. But we can mitigate it as much as possible by making sure that that progesterone, the estrogen, it all floats up and down in the right manner to support the most healthy version of that cycle for you. Because like I said, like I feel bad in a way for female competitors, because it's like all of us have a short window on how long we can do this, male or female. Women have an extra short time period because there's like a number of years where you can compete, you can do it enhanced, you can do all those things and still manage to come out on the other side and be fertile. But then you start to get to this line where it's like, if I keep going, I have to now decide that I'm never going to be fertile again. If you have done this thing mismanaged for a decade already, right? Like if you started competing when you were 20 and by 21 you had a super aggressively dysregulated menstrual cycle and then you don't have it for years on end, which is what I've heard a number of times, like you're shortening that time span. And like I already said, there's so many things that happen to women as they age. When that menstrual cycle goes away, you don't want to start that early. You don't want to be going through menopause at 35. Like that doesn't sound fun, or 30 or whatever the craziness is. So it's like just understanding that like the that you cannot just throw a hormone or a pill at this and go, you're fixed, right? And that seems to be because it's much easier to get somebody to adhere to taking a pill daily than it is to get them to adhere to a better lifestyle. So like, of course, the doctors and the pharmaceutical companies are going to go, cool, we know how to fix you. Here's this pill. And then, of course, the person on the other end of it goes, my doctor told me this works. This is going to help. Cool. And that like that's the extent of what they do. And then they're doing the same thing with a coach because they're looking at a coach as if they are a doctor. They're the person in the place of power that is making decisions for you, right? You're not making these decisions. Somebody else is telling you, hey, take X, Y, Z. And you're going, damn Skippy, I'm going to do it, right? Without any thought process behind it and any like research, right? And like the thing that just blows my mind is these cycles that come at me from some of these other coaches that I've taken clients from. It's like, you were doing fucking what? You were taking how much of this? Like, are you okay? Like, is everything okay still? Like, it blows my mind. And then girls do that for year after year after year. And it just compounds to a point where it's like, at some point, it's not coming back. At some point, like, the unfortunate reality is men's physiology and like sexual function is a lot easier to manage than a female's. That doesn't mean that there's going to be men who like we can do every fertility protocol in the world and it's never going to come back, but that percentage is much smaller. Like we're much more resilient on the hormone side of things than females are. It's a very delicate balance. And if you're supposed to have your menstrual cycle for this number of decades and then you only have it for 5 years out of that time, like that sounds like a problem.
And this is even more prevalent for the individual who has been, let's say, living in a state of suppression due to hormonal birth control, which is something, I mean, like for listeners, if you're familiar, like I've talked about this very openly, is like if you are that person who's like, hey, what can I do to, what PEDs can I put in place to essentially optimize what my efforts are now, whether that be fat loss or hypertrophy? you really have to consider that, like, if you were causing suppression to these vital hormones that will dictate ovulation. And let me back up real quick too, because I want listeners to catch this. Just because you have a period, just because you have a bleed at some point in the month or every 2 months, doesn't mean that you're actually ovulating. So the actual bleed itself, that is in response to progesterone dropping, but you can have an amount of progesterone that's not sufficient enough. So this is why we typically see, if progesterone is too low, even if that egg was fertilized, it wouldn't keep. You wouldn't be able to see it out. There would be a part where that egg is now not viable. Now, what's important though, when we start talking about like really making sense of like, is this athlete in a position where they're healthy, where they're balanced? We can't just go off of having that period. And I think that's a good start. It absolutely is something like we should see. Like, an absence of a period is pretty much definitive. Like, you're not having that rise and fall of estradiol, of progesterone. Now, past that, you're getting the period, but maybe it's irregular. Maybe you're having wild swings in, let's say, the week before, the week of ovulation, or sorry, the week in which ovulation occurs, or the week of your period. If you're having those extreme symptoms of PMS, this is where, I mean, like, I had firsthand experience with this. My estrogen was still within normal ranges. It wasn't excessive. It wasn't in super physiological ranges, but my progesterone was only coming up marginally comparatively. So seeing that level of estradiol out of ratio relative to progesterone, that was causing what would seem like normal levels of estradiol to now be excessive and present with those manifestations of excess estrogen or unopposed estrogen, which we know has been linked to different types of either cervical or uterine cancer. I tend to mix those up whenever I talk about this, but going back, we got to see the rise of estradiol and progesterone on lab work. And that's the one thing a lot of people, they're just like, yeah, well, my athlete has her period, so it's cool. Or she gets it like when she's out of prep, or she gets it like a few months after she discontinues. But really mapping this out and being like, if you're going to compete from, let's say, 25 to 35, how many periods collectively have you missed? Because if you're supposed to have 12 a year and you're going 6 to 9 months without a period, let's say for a better part of 50% of that time, I guarantee you that's going to affect your ovarian reserve. And this was something, I mean, for the longest time, I've always said, like, I don't know if kids are in the future, but being 29, I'm like, okay, well, if it's not a no, I do need to have some kind of idea of like, what is my ovarian reserve, which is why I actually went and had my AMH, my anti-Müllerian hormone, checked. And it turns out, yeah, like, no surprise to me, it's like that number is much lower, not necessarily, terrible, but it's much lower than where you would expect it to be at 29. Whereas you look at someone who maybe hasn't competed, my sister's a good example, being in her 30s, having had multiple kids at this point, even through IVF, her AMH, much higher, much more appropriate for her age, and even potentially resilient based on different classifications. We have to consider these things, though, when we're talking about the female who maybe is more of a recreational competitor and even like a hobbyist. I just want to do one show, just see how it feels, see how I perform. If you're close to that family planning stage, we need to have this information. And this isn't to say like, well, if your coach doesn't have this checked, they're a bad coach. It's not it at all. It's just to say like, it is your responsibility. And if you're not working with a coach who maybe is aware that like these things are important to you, I would say at baseline, the starting point is having that conversation with them about it being a priority.
100%. Yeah. I mean, like the coach, if you tell the coach, hey, get me on stage and make me look my best ever, like they might have one version of it. Right. And if they think that like all hands off, like go at it, like then they're probably going to have a bit less focus on that, So like if it's something that's important to you, you need to like, even if it's something that you're like, yeah, maybe I definitely want to have kids someday. Like if you're in your early look, I had my son when I was 27. I'm 31. He's 4. Like I was not planning on having a kid at 27. So like, to even even now, like if I was like didn't have a kid and I was going, I would still like to have kids. I wasn't prepared to have one, but like trying to make that decision at like in your early 20s that like, I'm never going to worry about that is like such a drastic thing, because like 5 years later that could be completely shifted. But if you did a bunch of damage in those 5 years, you might not have a choice anymore. And that's the unfortunate thing for women is like you have to be very mindful of that if it is something that you do want. Of like what you do in your early 20s will reflect on what happens in your 30s and when you are ready for kids, right? Like if you can be ready for kids,